Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda. Is it accurate to describe the upcoming elections in Moldova, scheduled for September 28, as a duel between the pro-EU and pro-Russian camps? Has Russia been at least partly successful in influencing a significant number of Moldovan voters? And what might happen if pro-Russian forces win? I discussed these questions and more with Denis Cenusa, an associate expert at the Center for Geopolitics and Security Studies in Vilnius. Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. Denis, what you can say about the state of play in Moldova before the elections? Who is fighting whom over what? And is it fair to describe it as a duel between the pro-EU and pro-Russian camps?
I don't think that these elections are very different from the general sense of what you see in Moldova when it comes to politics. It's always about pro-EU orientation of the country versus, what can be the risk if pro-Russian forces are coming to power. What is different now from the previous electoral iterations, if we can say so, is that we have a full control of power by one political party that has very close ties with Brussels, with the EU institutions, and a mobilization of different political forces that in the past were associated with Russia and didn't manage over time to really erase the suspicions that they may still be in close dialogue with Moscow. So I think that the perception about Moldovan politics is that there is still uncertainty about the behavior of certain politicians. And those politicians usually are associated with Russia or with the Eurasian Union, in general, with the Eastern orientation of the country, which is not something you can tell about the ruling party that has a very transparent relationship with the EU. Everything is on the table. They clearly say what they want to achieve in this relationship. At the same time, I should say that we have also political parties that are in the opposition and have pro-EU views. So it's not that only the ruling party has as its priority to bring Moldova into the EU. We have also different small political parties that will try their chance to adhere to the new legislative, but they don't really have big chances to achieve this goal. So overall, we have, as you mentioned, two big camps, those who are behind and who are supporting the ruling party. They have a clear pro-EU stance. And then we have different smaller political parties, which are viewed as being Russian proxies. Some of them have a very clear profile. For instance, the political parties that belong to the Ilan Shor political network, the Moldovan oligarch who is now residing in Moscow, from where he's coordinating different hybrid activities that are carried out on Moldovan territory and are aligned with Russian strategic interests in Moldova. And then obviously there are many other smaller political parties where you have usually pro-EU politicians that are running those political parties, but they will probably claim that the EU is overlooking them because is trying to support the biggest or the strongest pro-EU political party, which is the current ruling party.
What about the polls? I know any forecast is tricky, but we are just 1 week before the election. So what do polls tell us about the possible results?
The possible results, if we look at the polls, are looking not good for the ruling party, because even the last poll, which I think was published this week, gave about 30 to 35 seats to the ruling party, which is not enough to have a majority. Obviously, the polls cannot really estimate very early the voting in the diaspora. which sometimes can have, a critical impact on the outcome. So therefore, we should take it with a grain of salt. It's not as, I would say, as clear and as precise as probably some, supporters of Moldovan EU integration in the West are expecting. But we can say that the two political forces will be present in the future parliament for sure. So this is the current ruling party and the patriotic bloc, comprising different four political parties that somehow have been descendants of the Communist Party, including the Communist Party. So you have the Socialists, you have the Heart of Moldova, then you have the Future of Moldova, and the Communists that form this bloc. I would say it's a very uniform bloc, because you really have political parties that are supporting this multi-vector foreign policy, which also means to resume the strategic dialogue with Russia, and everything else that somehow will bring, the past status quo into life. And then you have our party run by Renato Usate, the former mayor of Velts, who could also join the future of the next parliament, as well as the Bloc Alternativa. That is less uniform, I would say, than the Patriotic Bloc, because you have political parties and politicians who really changed their political views. So, for instance, you have the mayor of Chisinau, Ion Ciobanu, who was previously a very fierce supporter of Moldova joining Eurasian Union, and now he is claiming that he changed his stance and he would like to see Moldova as part of the EU. Obviously, he has different, I would say, exemptions from certain EU integration aspects. Like, for instance, he is very much against promotion of LGBTQ rights and other similar, policies, as well as the former candidate for the presidential elections, Alexandru Stoianoglu, and two other political parties that are smaller, but altogether they tried to really catch the voter that is disappointed in the current ruling party, as well as has a more Eurosceptic view. So they are not fully against the EU, but they are very selective when it comes to how the EU accessions should take place and whether the Moldova should be negotiating on harsh conditions and in a very harsh way, or it should be more receptive and offer more concessions to the EU, in exchange for a faster track. So they are against faster track. They would really be in favor of having a very meticulous negotiation with the EU so that, according to them, Moldovan national interests are protected and against any sort of, quickly made decisions that could harm the economy when it comes to exports, local producers, or even the ownership over the land, which is another very sensitive topic that has been raised with the previous years and previous elections, not so much this time.
So how much is the future foreign policy or foreign policy orientation of the country the main issue that shapes the campaign?
Well, I think that your question points to the essential part of this campaign, which is the focus on foreign policy. It's really not about economics or certain structural reforms. Everything is about whether the country will keep its path toward the EU, if the country will avoid military conflict, for instance. So I think that the war, probably the leitmotif of both of the ruling party as well as the patriotic bloc. For some reason, they decided to mobilize the voters by using this discourse about the risks and the fears related to what will happen to Moldova if a pro-Russian or Russian-oriented political forces will take the power. This is something that the ruling party is saying, pass. And on the other hand, you have one of the leaders of the patriotic bloc, Igor Dodon, saying that in order to stay in power, the ruling party alleged could, even trigger a conflict in the Transnistrian region, and with this, to stay longer in power. Obviously, the two sides are probably using a little bit of speculative discourse because Moldova is in such sensitive position that it cannot afford to start any conflict against anybody, even to use military means to reintegrate the country, which the current government have never said is intending to do. It's only peaceful means that will be used to solve the Transnistrian conflict. By the way, the same discourse is also used by Kiev despite of the certain statements, made by Ukrainian politicians about the capacity of Ukraine to solve the Transnistrian conflict very quickly, given the superiority, military superiority, as well as the experience in fighting the Russian aggression. The Ukrainians, yes, they have enough, capability and military, I think, maturity to solve any sort of issues. The idea is that nobody's really interested in creating another escalation and export the war outside of Ukrainian borders. Even the Russians would not like to see that happening, because they will definitely lose any leverage over the Transnistrian region if they decide to do so. So in a way, it's very complicated to understand why this decision was made to focus so much on war. But I believe that because the social economic situation is so dire in the country, even for the ruling party, it's very difficult to engage with the voters discussing about economics. Just because I think that the arguments coming from the opposition are stronger, because the opposition doesn't really have anything at stake. So they are sometimes very populist in their discourse. And whatever will be the argument, counter-argument coming from the ruling party, they will not stand against the criticism that is coming from the opposition, which is saying that the ruling party had the full control over the country for 4 years. And they, in a way, are right, politically speaking, right? Of course, they overlook the crises that the country went through and many other factors that led to the situation in which Moldova is now. But if we look strictly at the political, balance of power in the country, then yes, the ruling party had political influence over the state institutions, and they still continue to do so. So in a way, at the moment, we are witnessing a very emotional times debate, because it's about the war in Ukraine, which is obviously a dramatic experience of Moldova's neighbor. And it can be, interpreted and misinterpreted in different ways, depending which camp is talking about that. The ruling party, which has full solidarity with Ukraine and is supporting the EU in helping Ukraine, they will be all the time on the right side of the history in a way. But those who are questioning, I would say, the honesty of the ruling party in supporting Ukraine without, seeking its own political and electoral bonuses, they will obviously be criticized by those who are supporting Ukraine in this situation.
In the summer, Moldova's President Maya Sandu said that Russia is planning an unprecedented election interference campaign in the country, and she claimed that Kremlin has earmarked up to the 100 million euros for cyber attacks, paid protests, manipulation, and schemes to discredit the electoral process. Considering her words, what specific can we say about the Russian efforts to influence the election?
I remember the statements that Moldova has managed to reduce fully the Russian influence. This statement is obviously very positive and very optimistic, but in my view, we are far from being, in a way, outside of Russian influence at the moment. And I believe that that's the reason why we have so much attention from Russia towards the electoral process in Moldova. So it was, I think now it's more acute than it was last year, because obviously the country is, is a parliamentary republic. So the power is concentrated in the hands of the members of the parliament. And if Maya Sandu doesn't have that majority, comfortable majority, then she will have literally a very hard time to do anything in supporting her current political agenda, which is why for her it's very important to, in a way, support her political party, which is exactly where she is stepping into a very, I would say, problematic area, because, she has administrative resources, and according to the electoral legislation, she is not allowed to do so. But anyway, if we talk about the Russian influence, then it's very intense. It's happening on different fronts. You already mentioned some of them. And I think that disinformation is one of the most critical areas, because Russia can launch new sites. It can recycle information. It is very carefully looking into all the mistakes or miscommunication that is made by the current government. It's also distorting the context in which certain statements are made by the EU officials who are supporting Moldova and are supporting the ruling party. So the sophistication of Russian interferences in this media space, it's unlimitless, unfortunately, for the security of the media space of Moldova. Obviously, a lot of efforts has been now allocated to counter that. And I would say that without the EU funds and without the know-how coming from different EU member states, Moldova would have much worse situation and preparedness to counter Russian disinformation than it does now. But I think that where probably we could see many surprises going to be in the way Moldovans are voting, because we have, as I mentioned before, we have a social economic situation that is complicated for many families and for different segments of the society. So according to national statistics, and I think that you have heard about that, we have about 34% of the population that is in absolute poverty. This is a huge number. It's like 1/3 of the population. And you cannot really compensate, the lack of normal, I'm not saying good, I'm saying normal living conditions with the argument that Moldova will join the EU and everything will be solved overnight. So we need it, because now it's too late. We needed different results which are tangible for the population, so that population is not becoming a voter for the parties that are using populist messages and that are referring all the time to the paradise that can be offered by Russia through cheap gas or through access to the Russian market. And I think that here is exactly this biggest vulnerability that Moldova has. And unfortunately, we don't know how it will really backfire at the elections. So at the moment, the focus is exactly on mobilizing the diaspora. And I believe this is really my assumption. It's a hypothesis that I have, that one of the reasons why the ruling party is using the discourse about war and kind of reminding the war that is happening in Ukraine because of Russian aggression is exactly because it relies very much on the votes coming from the diaspora. And the diaspora is really, I think, better off than Moldovan population that is struggling economically. So they will be probably convinced and persuaded to vote for the ruling party because of this strategic problems or insecurities that the ruling party is displaying to the public and to its Western partners as something that Moldova should look for in order to solve if the ruling party remains in power, if it maintains its power, basically.
Then, as you mentioned, disinformation and other means how Russia is trying to impact Moldova's elections. So, do you believe that Russia has been at least partly successful in affecting maybe even a significant number of Moldovan voters?
Look, I think that we are giving a bigger credit to Russia than we should do. I understand the subtext of your question because this is basically my bread and butter. I'm analyzing Russian disinformation and I'm looking at the trends. And I can tell you that they are trying to, including build digital armies, like certain investigative journalists have revealed, and that's true. They're trying to do so, but they are incredibly inefficient when it comes to even recruiting people. Because if the journalists are managing to infiltrate, then well, what kind of really competence they have in this regard? So obviously they have many people, but we don't know whether those people are not doing that for pure money rewards before the elections and how they will vote during the elections. So it's a big question mark whether those people who are really taking part, they are ideologically on the side of Russia, or they do that because they want to earn some money and have some spare funds that are coming from Russia. So this is the first answer. Now the second answer will be probably about the way the government is perceived by the public. And in my view, although it was a lot of effort directed to improve the strategic communication and to, in a way, keep the population closer to the official sources of information. So in order to make sure that you have that legitimacy and credibility of the government, I think that this was not, again, successfully achieved because the social economic situation in the country is not good. So now you have many people that will not be very hard to convince to vote against the ruling party because they are on the losing side, so they are lagging behind in this process, of achieving the EU accession as quickly as possible and implement certain reforms. So you have a big chunk of the population that is lagging behind. And I think that population will not be that difficult to convince, to vote against the government just because they are not doing well. So their fridge their stomach is empty. So they will believe much faster And they will embrace much more the criticism against the government, regardless if it's coming from Russia or it's internally produced by the political dynamics, because you also have ruling party and the opposition, and not all the opposition is pro-Russian. You have also opposition that has legitimate arguments against what the government is doing or not doing well. So all of that combined, both Russian disinformation as well as legit criticism, is creating like a snowball effect, and it goes down very fast, So for the government to stop this rolling down snowball, it has been very hard. And I think that they had used the support of civil society organizations with the EU funds, the media, and the support of the EU institutions and the EU member states. But this is not enough when you have structural problems related to the economy. It's very hard to counter the reality. And the reality in the country is really rather pessimistic than positive. Even if Moldova has been successful in, improving all the prospects for the EU accession to happen in the nearest future.
Can I ask you to use your crystal ball? Do you think that there is at least some chance that the pro-EU forces and Maia Sandu's parties will win the elections?
I think that we will have a future government that will be forced by the domestic and regional circumstances to keep the dialogue with the EU. And this will happen only if we don't have very serious allegations proved with evidence that Russia interfered and the government is now deciding to cancel the elections. If the scenario of cancellation is not going to materialize, then I believe that parties that will enter the new parliament, they will have to build the consensus in order to avoid the political crisis. Because if they don't do that, we will have early elections. And early elections means more populists coming into the parliament and fewer seats for the current ruling party, as well as the probability that the future coalitions will be more into having this multi-vector foreign policy than if we have a government created as a result of the elections on the 28th of September.
And what would it mean for Moldova if really pro-Russian forces win the war?
I believe that Moldova will have to really Moldovans, because Moldova, is a result of the government and the governing process over the population. So I think that Moldovans will be most likely protesting, if to be honest. Anything that will be changing the current course of the country in sense of the orientation towards the EU is going to trigger protests, and those protests will probably be exactly this reality check for the new government. So they will not be able to implement policies that will really break Moldova away from the current trend, which is the EU accession. It doesn't mean that we will not have challenges when it comes to, how the dialogue with Russia is being revised, for instance, whether the sanctions will be lifted by Moldovan government, if it will be justified as an economic policy, because that will be also an interesting aspect to watch after the elections. And if such a government is being installed, definitely. But I believe that a population will be very, very sensitive if anything radical will be proposed by the future government, if that government is controlled by forces that will suggest that the Moldovan state should reorient towards Eurasian integration projects.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also the description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.